Hey everybody, like I promised you, we're going to go live again for chapter 12. We're trying to finish up the book this weekend, and because everybody's been joining us, listening to all the different chapters, we are on chapter 12 now.
And we're going to read 2 chapters.
Oh, 2 chapters, not one? Okay, we'll read 2 chapters then. And I hope you got a chance to join us when we went over to the Illinois Veterans Home. I wanted everybody to see it because we always talk about it. But now we're going back over this. Now remember, Gene Wilder died. And he's the original, when they were in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, was actually used as an actual candy campaign. It was actually one of the world's longest commercials for Wonka. Now, where we're at is so far they're coming back in. They're going down at so fast that they need to crash into the roof of the chocolate factory. The nids are all evaporated and blown up and all that other stuff. And now they already released the other capsule with all the other astronauts in it. So now they're coming down and they need to crash in, but they need to have a high velocity. And everybody is screaming and crashing, and Grandma Georgina is just freaking out, and Grandpa Joe is,
if you can see,
he was in charge of the tow.
If you can see right there.
Okay, so now what we have to do is we are on back to the chocolate factory. Are we ready? All right, so are we ready? Okay. All right, I'll scooch over. Okay, here we go.
I don't want to be Mrs.
All right.
Squishy.
Back to the chocolate factory. Crash! And then the noise of splintering wood and broken glass and absolute darkness and the most awful crunching sounds as the elevator rushed on, smashing everything before it. All at once, the crashing noises stopped and the ride became smoother, and the elevator seemed to be traveling on a guides or rails, twisting and turning like a roller coaster. And when the lights came on, Charlie suddenly realized that for the last few seconds he hadn't been floating at all. He had been standing normally on the floor. Mr. Wonka was on the floor too, and so was Grandpa Joe and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, and also the big bed. As for Grandma Josephine, Grandma Georgina, and Grandpa George, they must have fallen right back onto the bed because they were now all three on top of it and scrambling to get under the blankets. "We're through!" yelled Mr. Wonka. "We've done it! We're in!" Grandpa Joe grabbed him by the hand and said, "Well done, sir! How splendid! What a magnificent job! Where in the world are we now?" said Mrs. Bucket. "We're back, Mother," Charlie cried. "We're in the chocolate factory." "I'm very glad to hear it," said Mrs. Bucket. "But didn't we come rather a long way round?" "We had to," said Mr. Wonka, "to avoid the traffic." They had to come a long way around to avoid traffic in space. Okay. "I have never met a man," said Grandma Georgina, "who talks so much absolute nonsense." "A little nonsense now and then is relished by the wisest men," Mr. Wonka said. "Why don't you pay some attention to where this crazy elevator's going?" shouted Grandma Josephine, "and stop footing about." "A little footing round about will stop you going up the spout," said Mr. Wonka. "What did I tell you?" cried Grandma Georgina. "He's round the twist. He's bogged as a beetle. He's dotty as a dingbat. He got rats in the roof. I want to go home." "Too late," said Mr. Wonka. "We're there." The elevator stopped. The doors opened and Charlie found himself looking out once again at the great chocolate room with the chocolate river and the chocolate waterfall, where everything was edible. The trees, the leaves, the grass, the pebbles, even the rocks. And there to meet them were hundreds and hundreds of tiny Oompa Loompas, all waving and cheering. It was a sight that took one's breath away. Even Grandma Georgina was stunned into silence for a few seconds, but not too long. "Who in the world are all those particular little men?" she said. "They're Oompa Loompas," Charlie told her. "They're wonderful. You'll love them." "Shh," said Grandpa Joe. "Listen, Charlie. The drums are starting up. They're going to sing." "Allez," said the Oompas. "Oh, allez and hooray. Our Willy Wonka's back today. We thought you'd never make it home. We thought you left us all alone. We knew that you wouldn't have to face some frightful creatures up in space. We even thought we heard the crunch of someone eating you for lunch. Oompa, oompa, oompa-dee, Our Willy Wonka's back today. We thought you'd never make it home. We thought we'd be left all alone. We knew that you would have to face some frightful creatures up in space, when even though we heard the crunch of someone eating you for lunch. Oompa, oompa, oompa dee, I added the Oompa Oompas, okay? All right, shouted Mr. Wonka, laughing and raising both hands. Thank you for your welcome. Will some of you please help to get this bed out of here? 50 Oompa Loompas ran forward and pushed the bed with the 3 old ones in it out of the elevator. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, both looking completely overwhelmed by it all, followed the bed out. Then came Grandpa Joe, Charlie, and Mr. Wonka. Now, said Mr. Wonka, addressing Grandpa George, Grandma Georgina, and Grandma Josephine, up you hop out of that bed and let's get cracking. I'm sure you'll want to lend a hand running the factory. Who, us? Said Grandma Josephine. Yes, you, said Mr. Wonka. You must be joking, said Grandma Georgina. I never joke, said Mr. Wonka. Now just you listen to me there, sir, said old Grandpa George, sitting up straight in bed. You've got us into quite enough troubles and troubles for one day. I've gotten you out of them too, said Mr. Wonka proudly, and I'm going to get you out of that bed as well. You see, if I don't. Chapter 13.
We're going to read 2 chapters.
We're going to read 2 chapters because this one goes right into it. We're almost done with the book. How Wonka-Vite was invented. Wonka-Vite. I'm going to start over with the last chapter from the last because we got to go right into the 13th chapter. I've gotten you out of them too, said Mr. Wonka proudly, and I'm going to get you out of that bed as well. You see, if I don't. I haven't been out of this bed in 20 years, and I'm not getting out now for anybody, said Grandma Josephine firmly. Nor me, said Grandma Georgina. You were out of it just now, every one of you, said Mr. Wonka. That was floating, said Grandpa George. We couldn't help it. We never put our feet on the floor, said Grandma Josephine. Try it, said Mr. Wonka. You might surprise yourself. Go on, Josie, said Grandpa Joe. Give it a try. I did. It was easy. We're perfectly comfortable where we are, thank you very much, said Grandma Josephine. Mr. Wonka sighed and shook his head very slowly and very sadly. Oh, well, he said, so that's that. He laid his head on one side and gazed thoughtfully at the 3 old people in the bed. And Charlie watched him closely, saw those bright little eyes of his beginning to spark and twinkle once again. Ha ha, thought Charlie, what's coming now? I suppose, said Mr. Wonka, placing the tip of one finger on the point of his nose and pressing gently, I suppose because this is a very special case, I suppose I could spare you just a tiny little bit of... He stopped and shook his head. A tiny little bit of what? Said Grandma Josephine sharply. No, said Mr. Wonka, it's pointless. You seem to have decided to stay in that bed no matter what happens. And anyway, the stuff is much too precious to waste. I'm sorry, I mentioned. He started to walk away. Hey, shouted Grandma Georgina. You can't start something and not go on with it. What is too precious to waste? Mr. Wonka stopped. Slowly he turned around. He looked long and hard to the 3 old people in the bed. They looked back at him, waiting. He kept silent a little longer, allowing their curiosity to grow. The Oompa Loompas stood absolutely still behind him, watching. What is this thing you're talking about, Grandma Georgina? Get on with it, for heaven's sake, said Grandma Josephine. Very well, Mr. Wonka said at last. I'll tell you, and listen carefully, because this could change your whole lives. It could even change you. I don't want to be changed, shouted Grandma Georgina. May I go on, madame? Thank you, not long ago. I was fooling about in my inventing room, stirring stuff around and mixing things up the way I do every afternoon at 4 o'clock, when suddenly I found I had made something that seemed very unusual. This thing I made kept changing color as I looked at it, and now and again it gave a little jump. It actually jumped up in the air as though it were alive. What have we here? I cried. I rushed it quickly to the testing room and gave some to the Oompa Loompa who was on duty there at the time. The result was immediate. It was flabbergasting. It was unbelievable. It was also rather unfortunate. What happened? Said Grandma Georgina, sitting up. What indeed? Said Mr. Wonka. Answer her question, said Grandma Josephine. What happened to the Oompa Loompa? Oh, said Mr. Wonka. Yes. Well, there's no point in crying over spilled milk, is there? I realized, you see, that I had stumbled upon a new and tremendous, powerful vitamin, and I also knew that if only I could make it safe, if only I could stop it doing to others what it did to the Oompa Loompa. What did it do to the Oompa Loompa? Said Grandma Georgina sternly. The older I get, the deafer I become, said Mr. Wonka. Do please raise your voice a trifle next time. Thank you so much. Now then, I simply had to find a way of making this stuff safe, so that people could take it without, Without what? Snapped Grandma Georgina. Without a leg to stand on, said Mr. Wonka. So I rolled up my sleeves and I set to work once more in the inventing room. I mixed and I mixed. I must have tried just about every mixture under the moon. By the way, there is a little hole in one wall of the inventing room which connects directly with the testing room next door, so I was always able to keep passing stuff through for the testing to whichever brave volunteer happened to be on duty. Well, the first few weeks were pretty depressing, and we won't talk about them. Instead, let me tell you what happened on the 132nd day of my labs. That morning, I had changed the mixture drastically, and this time the little pill I produced at the end of it all was not nearly so active or alive as the others had been. It kept changing colors, yes, but only from lemon yellow to blue, then back to yellow again. And when I placed it on the palm of my hand, it didn't jump about like a grasshopper. It only quivered, and then ever so slightly. I ran to the hole in the wall that led to the testing room. A very old Oompa Loompa was on duty there that morning. He was a bald, wrinkled, toothless old fella. He was in a wheelchair. He had been in a wheelchair for at least 15 years. This is the test number 132, I said, chalking it up at the board. I handed him the pill. He looked at it nervously. I couldn't blame him for being a bit jittery after what happened to the other 131 volunteers. What had happened to them? Shouted Grandma Georgina. Why don't you answer the question instead of skidding around on two wheels? Who knows the... Can you hold that real quick? Hold on. My alarm's going off.
His alarm's going off.
Well... Okay, alarm was just going off. Sorry about that.
Here's the page number that we're on. There's just, if you need to grab anything, a water bottle or anything else, you can grab it. It's intermission time. So
not intermission. I'm coming back.
He's coming back. But if you need
to the radio, coming back
that's
to
really
reality.
a good time. So...
You know me, Grace. I'm here.
Yeah.
Daddy. Okay, here we go. Sorry. My alarm was going off. I didn't realize what time it was. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Sorry. My fault. All right, I'm here. All right, here we go. Okay.
Hey, we gotta pull this up.
No, we're fine. All right, ready? No. This, okay. What happened to them? Shouted Grandma Joanna. Why don't you answer the question instead of skidding around in two wheels? Who knows the way out of a rose? Said Mr. Wonka. Who knows the way out of a rose? Said Mr. Wonka. So this brave old Oompa Loompa took the pill, and with the help of a little water, he gulped it down. Suddenly, the most amazing thing happened. Before my very eyes, queer little changes began taking place in the way he looked. A moment earlier, he had been practically bald.
Oh my God.
With just a fringe of snowy white hair around the sides and the back of his head. But now the fringe of the white hair was turning gold, and all over the top of his head, new gold hair was beginning to sprout like grass. In less than half a minute, he had grown a splendid new crop of long golden hair. At the same time, many of the wrinkles started disappearing from his face. Not all of them, but about half. Enough to make him look a good deal younger, and all this must have given him a nice, trickly feeling because he started grinning at me, then laughing. And as soon as he opened his mouth, I saw the strangest sight of all. Teeth were growing up, and from this old toothless gums, good white teeth. They were coming up so fast I could actually see them getting bigger and bigger. I was too flabbergasted to speak. I just stood there with my head poking through the hole in the wall, staring at the little Oompa Loompa. I saw him slowly lifting himself out of his wheelchair. He tested his legs on the ground. He stood up. He walked a few paces. Then he looked up at me, and his face was bright. His eyes were huge and bright as two stars. "Look at me," he said softly. "I'm walking. It's a miracle." "It's Wonka-Vite," I said. "The great rejuvenator. It makes you young again. How old do you feel now?" I thought very carefully about his question. Then he said, "I feel almost exactly how I felt when I was 50 years old." "How old were you just now before you took the Wonka-Vite?" I asked him. 70 last birthday, he answered. "That means," I said, "it has made you 20 years younger." It has, he cried, delighted. "I feel as frisky as a frog hopper." "Not frisky enough," I told him. 50 is still pretty old. "Let us see if I can help you a bit more. Stay right here where you are. I'll be back in a twink." I ran to my workbench and quickly made one more pill of Wonka-Vite, using exactly the same mixture as before. "Swallow this," I said, passing the second pill through the hatch. There was no hesitation this time. Eagerly, he popped it into his mouth and chased it down with a drink of water. And behold, within a half a minute, another 20 years had fallen away from his face and body, and he was now a slim and sprightly young Oompa Loompa of 30. He gave a whoop of joy and started dancing around the room, leaping high in the air and coming down on his toes. "Are you happy?" I asked him. "I'm ecstatic," he cried, jumping up and down. "I'm happy as a horse in a hayfield." He ran out of the testing room to show himself off to his family and friends. "Thus was Wonka-Vite invented," said Mr. Wonka, "and thus was it made safe for all to use." "Why don't you use it for yourself then?" said Grandma Georgina. "You told Charlie you were getting too old to run the factory, so why don't you just take a couple of pills and get 40 years younger? Tell me that." "Anyone can ask questions," said Mr. Wonka. "It's the answers that count. Now then, if there are three of you in the bed, would the three of you in the bed care to try a dose?" "Just 1 minute," said Grandma Josephine, sitting up straight. "First, I'd like to take a look at this 70-year-old Oompa Loompa who is now back to 30. Mr. Wonka flicked his finger. A tiny Oompa Loompa, looking young and perky, ran forward out of the crowd and did a marvelous little dance in front of the three old people in the bed. 2 weeks ago, he was 70 years old and in a wheelchair, Mr. Wonka said proudly, and look at him now. "The drums," Charlie said, Grandpa Joe. "Listen, they're starting up again." Far away down the bank of the Chocolate River, Charlie could see the Oompa Loompa band striking up once more. There were 20 Oompa Loompas in the band, each with an enormous drum twice as tall as himself, and they were beating a slow, mysterious rhythm that soon had all the other hundreds of Oompa Loompas swinging and swaying from side to side. In a kind of trance, they began to chant. "If you are old and have the shakes, if all your bones are full of aches, if you can hardly walk at all, if living drives you up the wall, if you grump and full of spite, if you're a human parasite, then what you need is Wonka-Vite. Your eyes will shine, your hair will grow, your face and skin will start to glow, your rotten teeth will drop out, and in their place new teeth will sprout. Those rolls of fat around your hips will vanish, and your wrinkled lips will get so soft and rosy pink that all the boys will smile and wink and whisper secretly that this is just the girl they want to kiss. But wait, for what is not the most important thing of which is to boast. Good looks you'll have to so. But looks aren't everything, you know. Each pill as well to you will give an extra 20 years to live. So come, old friends, and do what's right. Let's make your lives as bright as bright. Let's make a dose of this delight, this heavenly magical dynamite. You can't go wrong, you must go right. It's Willy Wonka's Wonka-Vite. Oh my gosh. Chapter 14. Receipt for the Wonka-Vite.
Let's do it again. I want to read it again. Not this, but I want to do another chapter.
Okay, one more chapter. Gracie wants to do another chapter. "Here it is," cried Mr. Wonka, standing at the end of the bed and holding high in one hand a little bottle. The most valuable bottle of pills in the world. "And that, by the way," he said, giving Grandma Georgina a saucy glance, "is why I haven't taken any myself. They are far too impossible to waste on me. He held the bottle out over the bed. The three old ones sat up and stretched their scrawny necks, trying to catch a glimpse of the pills inside. Charlie and Grandpa Joe also came forward to look. So did Mr. and Mrs. Bucket. The label said, Wonka-Vite. Each pill will make you younger by exactly 20 years. Caution, do not take more than the amount recommended by Mr. Wonka. They could all see the pills through the glass. They were a brilliant yellow, shimmering and quivering inside the bottle. Vibrating is perhaps a better word. They were vibrating so badly each pill became a blur, and you could see its shape. You could see only its color. You got the impression that there was something very small but incredibly powerful, something not quite of this world, locked up inside them and fighting to get out. They're wriggling, said Grandma Georgina. I don't like things that wriggle. How do we know they won't go on wriggling inside us after we swallow them? Like those Mexican jumping beans of Charlie's I swallowed a couple years back. You remember that, Charlie. I told you not to eat them, Grandma. They went on jumping about inside me for a month, said Grandma Josephine. I couldn't sit still. If I'm going to eat one of those pills, I sure as heck want to know what's in it first, said Grandma Josephine. I don't blame you, said Mr. Wonka. But the recipe is extremely complicated. Wait a minute. I've got it written down somewhere. He started digging around in the pockets of his coattails. I know it's here somewhere, he said. I couldn't have lost it. I keep all my most valuable, important things in this pocket. The trouble is, there's such a lot of them. He started emptying the pocket and placing the contents on the bed. A homemade catapult, a yo-yo, a trick fried egg made of rubber, a slice of salami, a tooth with a filling in it, a stink bomb, a packet of itching powder. It must be here. It must be. He kept muttering. I put it away so carefully. Ah, here it is. He unfolded a crumpled piece of paper, smothered it, held it up, and began to read the following. Receipt for making Wonka-Vite. Take a block of finest chocolate weighing 1 ton, or 20 sackfuls of broken chocolate, whichever is easiest. Place chocolate in a very large cauldron and melt over red-hot furnace. When melted, lower heat slightly so as not to burn the chocolate, but keep it boiling. Now add the following in precisely the order given, stirring well all the time and allowing each item to dissolve before adding the next. The hoof of a manticore. The trunk and the suitcase of an elephant. The yolks of 3 eggs from a wiffle bird. A wart from a warthog. A horn of a cow. It must be a loud horn. A front tail of a cockatrice. 6 ounces of sprung from a young slime scraper. 2 hares and 1 rabbit from the head of a hippocampus. The beak of a red-breasted walbratus. A corn from the toe of a unicorn. A corn from the toe of a unicorn. The 4 tentacles of a quadrupus. The hip and the paw and the pot of a hippopotamus. The snout of a proghopper. A mole from a mole. The hide and the seek of a spotted wangdoodle. The whites of 12 eggs from a tree squeak. The 3 feet of a snozawanger. If you can't get 3 feet, 1 yard will do. The square root of a South America abacus. The fangs of a viper. It must be a vidshield viper. The chest and the drawer of a wild grout. You want to use all that stuff? When all the above are thoroughly dissolved, boil for a further 27 days, but do not stir. At the end of this time, all liquid will have evaporated, and there will be left in the bottom of the cauldron only a hard brown lump about the size of a football. Break this open with a hammer, and in the very center of it, you will find a small round pill. This pill is Wonka-Vite. Chapter 15. Goodbye, Georgina. When Mr. Wonka had finished reading the recipe, he carefully folded the paper and put it back into his pocket. A very, very complicated mixture, he said. So, can you wonder it took me so long to get it just right? He held the bottle up high and gave it a little shake, and the pills rattled loudly inside it, like the glass beads. Now, sir, he said, offering the bottle first to Grandpa George, will you take one pill or two? Will you solemnly swear, said Grandpa George, that will do what you say it will and nothing else? Mr. Wonka placed his free hand on his heart. I swear it, he said. Charlie edged forward. Grandpa Joe came with him. The two of them always stayed close together. Please excuse me for asking, Charlie said, but are you really absolutely sure you've got it quite right? Whatever makes you ask a funny question like that, said Mr. Wonka. I was thinking of the gum you gave Violet Beauregard, Charlie said. So that's what's bothering you, cried Mr. Wonka. But don't you understand, my dear boy, that I never did give that gum to Violet? She snatched it without permission, and I shouted, stop, don't spit it out. I said, stop, don't spit it out, but the silly girl took no notice of me. Now Wonka-Vite is altogether different. I am offering these pills to your grandparents. I am recommending them, and when taken according to my instructions, they are as safe as a sugar candy. Of course they are, said Mr. Bucket. What are you waiting for, all of you? An extraordinary change had come over Mr. Bucket since he had entered the chocolate room. Normally he was a pretty timid sort of person. A lifetime devoted to screwing caps on the tops of toothpaste tubes in a toothpaste factory had turned him into a rather shy and quiet man. But the sight of the marvelous chocolate factory had made his spirit soar. What is more, this business of pills seemed to have given him a terrific kick. Listen, he cried, going on to the edge of the bed. Mr. Wonka's offering you a new life. Grab it while you can. It's a delicious sensation, Mr. Wonka said, and it's very quick. You'll lose a year a second. Exactly 1 year falls away from you every second. That goes by. He stepped forward and placed the bottle of pills gently in the middle of the bed. So here you are, my dear, he said. Help yourself. Come on, cried all the Oompa Loompas together. Come on, old friends, and do what's right. Come make your lives as bright as bright. Just take a dose of delight. This heavenly magic dynamite. You can't go wrong, you must go right. It's Willy Wonka's Wonka-Vite. This was too much for the old people in the bed. All three of them made a dive for the bottle. 6 scrawny hands shot out and started scrambling to get hold of it. Grandma Georgina got it. She gave a grunt of triumph and unscrewed the cap and tipped all the little brilliant yellow pills onto the blanket of her lap. She cupped her hand around them so the others couldn't reach out and snatch them. All right, she shouted, exactly counting them quickly. There's 12 pills here. There's 12 pills here. That's 6 for me and 3 for each of you. Hey, that's not fair, shrilled Grandma Josephine. It's 4 for each of us. 4 each is right, cried Grandpa George. Come on, Georgina, hand over my share. Mr. Wonka shrugged his shoulders and turned his back on them. He hated squabbles. He hated when people got grabby and selfish. Let them fight it out among themselves, he thought, and he walked away. He walked slowly down toward the chocolate waterfall. It was an unhappy truth, he told himself, that nearly all people in the world behave badly when there's something really big at stake. Money is the thing they fight over most, but these pills were bigger than money. They could do things for you no amount of money could ever do. They were worth at least $1 million a pill. He knew plenty of the very rich men who would gladly pay that much in order to become 20 years younger. He reached the river banks below the waterfall, and he stood there gazing at the great gush and splash of metal chocolate pouring down. He had hoped the noise of the waterfall would drown the arguing voice of the old grandparents in bed, but it didn't. Even with his back to them, he still couldn't help hearing most of what they were saying. I had them first, Grandma Georgina was shouting, so they're mine to hand out. Oh, no, they're not, shrilled Grandma Josephine. He didn't give them to you. He gave them all 3 of us. I want my share. No one's going to stop me getting it, yelled Grandpa George. Come on, woman, hand them over. Then came the voice of Grandpa Joe, cutting in sternly through the rabble. Stop this at once, he ordered. All 3 of you, you're behaving like savages. You keep out of this, Joe, and mind your own business, said Grandma Josephine. Now you be careful, Josie, Grandpa Joe went on. 4 is too many for one person anyway. That's right, Charlie said. Please, Grandma, why don't you just take 1 or 2 each like Mr. Wonka said? and that'll leave some for Grandpa Joe and Mother and Father. Yes, cried Mr. Bucket, I'd love one. Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful, said Mr. Bucket, to be 20 years younger and not have aching feet anymore? Couldn't you spare just one for each of us, Mother? I'm afraid not, said Grandma Georgina. These pills are especially reserved for us three in the bed. Mr. Wonka said so. I want my share, shouted Grandpa George. Come on, Georgina, dish them out. Hey, let me go, you brute, said Grandma Georgina. You're hurting me. Ow. All right, I'll share them if you'll stop twisting my arm. That's better. Here's 4 for Josephine, 4 for George, and 4 for me. Good, said Grandpa George. Now who's got some water? Without looking around, Mr. Wonka knew that the 3 Oompa Loompas would be running to the bed with 3 glasses of water. Oompa Loompas were always ready to help. There was a brief pause and then, well, here goes, cried Grandpa George. You, young and beautiful, that's what I'll be, shouted Grandma Josephine. Farewell, old age, cried Grandma Georgina. All together now, down the hatch. Then there was silence. Mr. Wonka was itching to turn around and look, but he forced himself to wait. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see a group of Oompa Loompas all motionless, their eyes fixed intently in the direction of the big bed by the elevator. Then Charlie's voice broke the silence. Wow, he was shouting. Just look at that. That's fantastic. It's incredible. I can't believe it, Grandpa Joe was yelling. They're getting younger and younger. They really are. Just look at Grandpa George's hair. And his teeth, cried Charlie. Grandpa, hey, Grandpa, you're getting lovely white teeth all over again. Mother, shouted Mr. Bucket to Grandma Georgina. Oh, Mother, you're beautiful. You're so young. And just look at Dad, she went on, pointing at Grandpa George. Isn't he the handsomest thing? What's it feel like, Josie, said Grandpa Joe exactly. Tell us what it feels like to be back to 30 again. Wait a minute. You look younger than 30. You can't be a day more than 20 now. But that's enough, isn't it? I wouldn't stop there if I were you. 20's quite young enough. Mr. Wonka shook his head sadly and passed a hand over his eyes. Had you been standing very close to him, you would have heard him murmuring softly under his breath. Oh, dearie, dearie me. Here we go again. Mother, cried Mrs. Bucket, and now there was a shrill note of alarm in her voice. Why don't you stop, Mother? You're going too far. You're way under 20. You can't be more than 15. You're 10. You're getting smaller, Mother. Josie, shouted Grandpa Joe. Hey, Josie, don't do it. Josie, you're shrinking. You're a little girl. Stop here. Somebody quick. They're all going too far, cried Charlie. They took too much, said Mr. Bucket. Mother's shrieking faster than any of them, wailed Mr. Bucket. Mother, can't you hear me? Mother, can't you stop? My heavens, isn't it quick, said Mr. Bucket, who seemed to be the only one enjoying it. It really is a year a second. But they've hardly got any more years left, wailed Grandpa Joe. Mother's no more than 4 now. Mrs. Bucket cried out. She's 3, 2, 1. Gracious me, what's happening to her? Where's she gone, Mother Georgina? Where are you? Mr. Wonka, come quickly, come here. Mr. Wonka, something's frightfully happening. Something's gone wrong. My old mother's disappeared. Mr. Wonka sighed and turned around and walked slowly and quite calmly back toward the bed. Where's my mother? Bawled Mrs. Bucket. Look at Josephine, cried Grandpa Joe. She just took it. Just look at her, I ask you. Mr. Wonka looked first at Grandma Josephine. She was sitting in the middle of a huge bed, bawling her head off. Wah, 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 she said. Wah, 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 wah. She's screaming baby, cried Grandpa Joe. I've got a screaming baby for a wife. The other one's Grandpa George, Miss Bucket said. Smiling happily, the slightly bigger 1-3 crawling around. He's my wife's father. That's right. He's my father, wailed Mr. Bucket. And where's Georgina, my old mother? She's vanished. She's nowhere, Mr. Wonka. She's absolutely nowhere. I saw her getting smaller and smaller, and in the end, she got so small she just disappeared into thin air. What I want to know is where she is gone, and how in the world are we going to get her back? Ladies and gentlemen, said Mr. Wonka, coming up close and raising both hands for silence. Please, I beg you, do not ruffle yourself. There's nothing to worry about. You call it nothing, cried poor Mrs. Bucket. when my old mother's gone up the spout and my father is a howling baby? A lovely baby, said Mr. Wonka. I quite agree, said Mr. Bucket. What about my Josie? Cried Grandpa Joe. What about her? Said Mr. Wonka. What about her? Said Mr. Well, a great improvement, sir, said Mr. Wonka. Don't you agree? Oh, yes, said Grandpa Joe. I mean, no. What I'm saying is she's a howling baby. But in perfect health, said Mr. Wonka. May I ask you, sir, how many pills she took? 4, said Grandpa Joe glumly. They all took 4. Mr. Wonka made a wheezing noise in his throat and looked at great anguish came over his face. Why? Oh, why can't people be more sensible? He said sadly. Why don't they listen to me when I tell them something? I explained very carefully beforehand that each pill makes the taker exactly 20 years younger. So if Grandma Josephine took 4 of them, she automatically became younger by 4 times 20, which is, wait a minute now, 4 2s are 8, add a naught, that's 80. So she automatically became younger by 80 years. How old, sir, was your wife, if I asked before this happened? She was 80 last birthday, Grandpa Joe answered. She was 80 in 3 months. There you are then, cried Mr. Wonka, flashing a happy smile. The Wonka-Vite worked perfectly. She is now precisely 3 months old, and a plump, rosier infant I've never set eyes on. Nor me, said Mr. Bucket. She'd win a prize in any baby competition. First prize, said Mr. Wonka. Cheer up, Grandpa, said Charlie, taking the old man's hand in his. Don't be sad. She's a beautiful baby. Madame, said Mr. Wonka, turning to Mrs. Bucket. How old, may I ask, was Grandpa George, your father? 81, wailed Mrs. Bucket. He was 81 exactly, which makes him a great big bouncing 1-year-old boy now, said Wonka happily. How splendid, said Mr. Bucket to his wife. You'll be the first person in the world to change her father's diapers. He can change his own rotten diapers, said Mrs. Bucket. What I want to know is, where's my mother? Where's Grandma Georgina? Aha, said Mr. Wonka. Ho, yes indeed. Where has Georgina gone? How old, please, was the lady in question? 78, Miss Bucket told him. Well, of course, laughed Mr. Wonka. That explains it. What explains what? Snapped Mr. Bucket. My dear madam, said Mr. Wonka, if she was only 78 and she took enough Wonka-Vite to make her 80 years younger, then naturally she's vanished. She's bitten off more than she could chew. She's taken off more years than she had. Explain yourself, said Mrs. Bucket. Simple arithmetic, said Mr. Wonka. Subtract 80 from 78, and what do you get? -2, said Charlie. Hooray, said Mr. Bucket. My mother-in-law is -2 years old. Impossible, said Mrs. Bucket. It's true, said Mr. Wonka. And where is she now, may I ask, said Mrs. Bucket. That's a good question, said Mr. Wonka. A very good question, yes indeed. Where is she now? You don't have the foggiest idea, do you? Of course I do, said Mr. Wonka. I know exactly where she is. Then tell me. You must try to understand, said Mr. Wonka, that if she is now -2, she's got to add 2 more years before she can start again from naught. She's got to wait it out. Where does she wait? Said Mrs. Bucket. In the waiting room, of course, said Mr. Wonka. Boom, boom, said the drums of the old Oompa Loompa band. Boom, 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 boom. And all the Oompa Loompas, all of the 100 of them, standing there in the chocolate room, began to sway and hop and dance in the rhythm music. Attention, please, they sang. Attention, please, don't dare to talk, don't dare to sneeze, don't doze or daydream, stay awake, your health, your very life's at stake. Ho, ho, you say you can't be mean, ha, ha, we answer, wait and see. Did any of you ever meet a child called Goldie Pinkle Sweet, who on her 70th birthday went to stay with Granny down in Kent? At lunchtime on the second day, our dearest little Goldie stay. Granny announced, I'm going down to do some plopping in the town. Do you know Granny didn't tell? Oh my gosh, I don't like this. The child to come along as well. She's going to the nearest inn to buy herself a double gin. So out she creeps, shuts the door. And Goldie, after making sure that she is really by herself, goes quickly to the medicine shelf. And there her little greedy eyes see pills of every shape and size. Such fantastic colors too, some green, some pink, and brown, some blue. All right, she says, let's try the brown. She takes one pill and gulps it down. Yum, yum, she cries, hooray, what fun. They're chocolate coated, everyone. She goggles 5, she gobbles 10. She stops her gobbling only when the last pill's gone. There are no more. So she rises from the floor. She stops, she hiccups, dear, oh, oh, dear. She starts to feel a trifle queer. You see, how could you, young Goldie, know? For nobody had told her so. That Grandma, all her old relations, suffered from a frightful constipation. This means that every night she'd give herself a powerful laxative, and all of the medicines that she had bought were naturally of all this sort. The pink and the red and the blue and green were exactly strong and mean, but far more fierce and meaner still was Granny's little chocolate pill. Its blast effect was quite uncanny. It used to shake up even Granny. In a point of fact, she did not dare to use them more than twice a year. So can you wonder, little Goldie began to feel a wee bit moldy. Inside her tummy something stirred. Oh my gosh. A funny gurgling sound was heard, and then, oh dear, from deep within, the ghastly rumbling sound began. The rumbling roar and boom, 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 then bounced and echoed round the room. The floorboard shaken from the wall, some bits of paint and plaster fall. Explosion whistles, awful bangs were following by the loudest clangs. A man next door was heard him say, the thunder is on its way. But on and on the rumbling goes, a window cracked, the light bulb blows. Young Goldie clutched herself and cried, there's something wrong with me inside. This was very gratefully feared. The understatement of the year, for wouldn't any child fear Crummy with loud explosions in her tummy? Granny at 2:30 came in, wearing a little from the gin. But even so, she quickly saw the empty bottle on the floor. My precious laxative, she cried. I don't feel well, the girls replied. Angry Grandma shook her head. I'm really not surprised, she said. Why can't you leave my pills alone? With this, grabbed the telephone and shouted, listen and send up quick. An ambulance, the child is sick. It's number 50 Fontainebleau Road. Come fast, I think she might explode. We're sure you do not wish to hear about the hospital and where they did a lot of horrid things with stomach pumps and rubber rings. Let's answer what you want to know. Did Goldie live or did she go? The doctors gathered round her bed. There's really not much hope, they said. She's going, gone, they cried. She had her chips. She's dead, she's died. I'm not sure, the child replied. And all at once she opened wide her giant big bluish eyes inside and gave the anxious doc a wink and said, it's okay, I think. So Goldie lived and back she went, at first to Granny's place to Kent. Her father came the second day and fetched her in a Chevrolet and drove her to their own home in Dover. But Goldie's troubles were not over. You see, if someone takes enough of any highly dangerous stuff, one will invariably find some traces of it left behind. It pained was us greatly to relate that Goldie suffered from this fate. Wow, almost done with this. She'd taken such a massive fill of this unpleasant kind of pill. It got her into blood and bones. It messed all her chromosomes. It made her constantly upset, and she could never really get the beastly stuff to go away. And so the girl was forced to stay for 7 hours every day within the everlasting gloom of what we call the ladies' room. And there she sits and dreams of glory along inside the lavatory. So now, before it is too late, take heed of Goldie's dreadful fate. And seriously, all jokes apart, do promise us across your heart that you will never help yourself to medicine from your medicine shelf. Wow, that was long. Chapter 16. We're going to do chapter 16 later?
Yeah.
Okay, we got chapter 16, 17, 18.
And then that's it.
19, 20. They're short, though. So we will read those later. We'll do bedtime stories tonight with the book, okay? So we're on chapter 16, Wonka minus use. Wow, was not expecting that. I forgot about that part. Okay, everybody, we read the book. We will come back later in the night and read the rest. We've got stuff to do today. Up. I gotta turn it off.
I'm tired.
I know. That was kind of long. Thanks, everybody. We will finish up the book by tomorrow. Tell everybody bye and tell them